Our first speaker is going to give the FP2 legislative update, Scott Bergkamp, and he's currently the president of FP2, formerly the Foundation for Pavement Preservation.
As David said, we're going to talk about the legislative update about what's happening in Washington. So far this meeting, we've been talking about a lot about aggregates and asphalt binders. Well, we're going to switch for a little bit to hard-headedness and sticky issues. Real quick background, FP2, for those of you that aren't familiar, has two main functions. The one is the legislative side, which we're going to talk about in this session, but just for information, the other part of FP2 is funding the preservation research that's happening at Minroad and NCAT. FP2 has been part of that since 2012, since the first preservation group experiment, and are continuing to fund that as they're doing their monitoring. With that, we're going to talk about the legislative update. This is what we're going to talk about. Talk about the infrastructure package. We're talking about things that have been going on that relates to surface transportation in Congress for the last year or so. We'll talk about what the administration's been up to, talk about the FAST Act, where it stands. As you can see, it expires September 30th of 2020, so a year and 6 days from now, the FAST Act will expire. It's going to get here before we know it. We'll talk about what the Senate's been doing to address this situation as well. So, of course, we go back to the beginning of 2019. Congress leadership changed in the House, and so we got a divided government. So we've got different players in charge, and so they're going to be pushing different points of view. These are the things that Congress has been dealing with. They have more to deal with than just transportation, as we well know. For starters, a 2-year budget deal that was done earlier this year, and that got the budget appropriations. The next time they have to talk about it is after the election, so that was the driver for doing that. But note that that's a two-part process. There's the budget and then there's funding bills. And so the funding bills, they get more specific. Those have yet to be done, so they're working on those. A continuing resolution got passed in the House last week. The Senate's expected to take it up in the very near future, so there'll be a continuing resolution maintaining the status quo for a while. Of course, we're going to talk about the infrastructure and the highway reauthorization that they're working on. And then these others are things that they're important right now. Congress has been working on, and of course it takes some of their limited time that takes away from what they can work on transportation. We talked about a divided government. Typically, infrastructure is something that both sides agree on. Both sides look at it and say, yeah, that's good for the country. We got to have good infrastructure. It's good for our citizens. It's good for commerce. It has a lot of benefits. But they come at it from two different points of view, and so that's got to get balanced out now that we've got a divided government. Here's what's been happening so far. Both the House and the Senate got started on this early in the year. They started having hearings about what was important, what the current state of the industry is, and what needs to happen. So that got started early. It was a good sign that early in the year, both sides of Congress got to working on this. Also, the administration got involved with an infrastructure package. We'll talk more about that later. And then House Ways and Means has had hearings on how to pay for it. That's critically important. We're going to get into all these details. So here's the major things that are on the table. So the Highway Trust Fund, for those of you, I imagine everyone here is familiar, but the Highway Trust Fund is going to run out of money in 2022. And so the current funding mechanism that's been in place since 1993 has been plugging along all these years. It's forecasted to run out of money in 2022, so it's got to be addressed. The Congress has also been talking about a major infrastructure bill. And so I want to make sure we understand when in this presentation, when I talk about an infrastructure package or an infrastructure bill, that's something the administration wanted to get going on. And when they say infrastructure, it's not just surface transportation, it's also naval ports, it's airports, it's broadband, it's the big picture of infrastructure that they wanted to get to working on. So that was their desire. We'll talk about where that went. Again, as the FAST Act is going to expire in 2020, there's a deadline for something to take place before then for a highway reauthorization bill. As Congress is talking about this, there's, again, some sticky issues. There are people looking at it from different points of view. The biggest thing for the highway reauthorization bill is how to pay for it. So we talked about the trust fund. It's going to run out of money. It needs to be addressed. The idea of addressing the current, okay, so a lot of people call it a gas tax, 18.3 cents per, 18.4, I forget, cents per gallon that goes to the Highway Trust Fund. A lot of people call it a gas tax. It'd be my preference it was called a user fee, because it really is a user fee. You put money into the trust fund when you buy a gallon of gas that 99% of the time is used to drive a vehicle on the road. Same with diesel. So it'd be nice if the larger public would look at this as a user fee. I'm paying money, but I get better highways to drive on. Sometimes it's called a user fee, sometimes called a gas tax, and sometimes that's politically driven what it's called. The whole question of indexing it. Of course, it wasn't indexed in 1993, and so we're suffering the effects of inflation as we go forward. That's going to be part of the conversation going forward, is if it gets addressed, will it be indexed at this time? VMT stands for Vehicle Miles Traveled. If you're not aware of this, there's conversation in different places, but including in Washington, about using a Vehicle Miles Traveled mechanism to fund the Highway Trust Fund. But there's some, and basically what that means is if you drive 1,000 miles, you're going to cost you so much going to the Highway Trust Fund. If you travel 500, it's half of that. And that addresses the issues like electric vehicles that don't ever fill up with fuel. So while that's minor now, the population of electric vehicles, we can certainly expect that to grow. So something like this may be necessary. The issues with it right now are, A, there's no, the hardware to do it, the service to do it. I mean, if there's a way of tracking your miles, does that mean that every taxpayer has to write a check to the federal government every month for how many miles you traveled? Stuff like that has not been decided upon, been worked out, or hardware that would do it automatically and track it automatically and report it. So there's that part of it. But there's also the part of just the privacy issues, that if you tell someone, I'm putting this on your car so we know how many miles you've traveled, they go, yeah, you're gonna pay attention to where I went too, and I don't want that. There's a personal side of the VMT that hasn't been worked out. On the environmental side, we all agree that we gotta pay attention to the environment, we gotta do what's best for the environment, but again, with divided government, they're gonna look at that different ways. The other thing about the funding that I need to mention is that over the last several runs of the of the reauthorization bill, there's been some budget moves, some accounting moves that said, okay, rather than that money being here, now it's over here. And it's pretty widely accepted in Washington that that's just not going to pass anymore. It's been done, and maybe done too much. On the administration side, they were after an infrastructure package early on and talking about investing $1 trillion in it. That included a long-term surface transportation reauthorization. It had money in there for other priorities like we talked about and other discretionary investments. It went a little ways in Congress, not very far. Again, how to pay for it wasn't identified early. So really the focus has switched to doing just surface transportation reauthorization. Here's what's happened in the House. So Chairman DeFazio, chairman of the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, for those of you that aren't real deep into Washington, what's happening in Washington, DeFazio's been a champion of transportation for a long time. He's been part of the T&I committee a long time. He's worked on bills in the past to address the Highway Trust Fund. DeFazio, he knows the issues, he knows the situation. So it's fantastic that he's the chairman of that committee. So DeFazio did start working with the administration. Like I say, didn't get very far on the infrastructure package, so went on to surface transportation. And as we've said, it's going to expire in a year. It's time to get after it. Fazio's been working with Graves from Missouri. Graves is in the same mindset. He understands transportation. And they just had a hearing, like I say, just a week or two ago about congestion, about the effects of congestion on the public and what the transportation bill might need to do about that. So that committee is working on the details of the plan. That's really good news. DeFazio has suggested a 1.5 cent user fee, increasing the user fee 1.5 cents. Now, you can look at that two ways. On one hand, 1.5 cents isn't going to go very far. It's only a little bit. On the other hand, he's trying to do something. He's trying to get something moving. And, I mean, if it would get addressed once, that would maybe break the log jam and cause more discussion, cause further movement. So I think he's just trying to maneuver the situation there. On the Senate side, the Senate didn't pay as much attention to the infrastructure package and went to work pretty quickly on the highway reauthorization bill. That second bullet's really good news. The Senate Environment and Public Works Committee unanimously passed a bill to become the next surface transportation bill. It's called America's Transportation Infrastructure Act. And I really wish they'd rename it, because that just does not roll off the tongue like the FAST Act or MAP 21. Like I say, you can see there a 27% increase in funding over the FAST Act, and a lot of that goes to the states by formula. So they made progress in working towards it. A couple other things that it does: nationally significant freight and highway projects, it's funding that. There's funds in there for safety improvements. They've looked at what the situation is and they're working to address it. The other thing it does is codifies the one federal decision. This is what the Trump administration's been doing to expedite projects through the permitting process. As we all know, some projects take way too long to get the permitting, and it might be one agency in Washington saying, yep, it's all good, go ahead, and another agency says, nope, you can't do it. The Trump administration has worked just within themselves to say, we're going to give you a yes or a no. And that means a yes means everyone's looked at it, and it's good to go, and get it done in a timely manner. The bill that the Senate has moved out of committee would make that part of the process that has to be followed all the time. Resiliency, as with the weather events we've been experiencing over the last number of years, resiliency is getting a lot of attention. We believe that in the language there that's in that bill, that would be proof positive for preservation to address some of these resiliency issues. It's not clear yet, and there's still work to be done. There's provisions in there for carbon emissions, pavement research, workforce development, so they've really addressed a lot of the issues. Again, we come back to funding. This is the bill that was passed, came out of Environment and Public Works, and so here's the money we want to spend on this and this and this, and the things we want to achieve, but it's the Senate Finance Committee that has to figure out how to pay for it. Like I say, it passed unanimously out of Environment and Public Works, but it's only half the battle. The other half is funding. The Finance Committee chair is looking for his leadership to say, give it some attention here. His leadership hasn't done that. Actually, when we just get into the situation, the Republicans don't want to be seen as raising taxes. That's part of the situation and how to get this paid for. And we talk about what's next. So the Senate, again, it's come out of Environment and Public Works. There's other aspects of the bill that belong to different committees, and they have to work on those yet. So the Commerce Committee owns the safety aspect of the bill. The Banking Committee has to work on the transit side of it. And then, of course, Finance Committee has to figure out how to pay for it. On the House of Representatives side, so the House T&I Committee, Transportation and Infrastructure, needs to pass a highway reauthorization bill, so they can choose to start with what the Senate passed or start with something different, but they need to bring something out of committee. House Ways and Means on the House side has to figure out how to pay for it. So again, two committees that have to decide how they're going to pay for this. And then, of course, House and Senate have to come together, and then the president has to agree. So there is a lot of work to be done here. We've got a good first step with the Environment and Public Works Committee bill, but still a long ways to go. When we talk about money, it's $100 billion that's needed to pay for that bill, between where the projections for the current Highway Trust Fund, what the Senate bill proposes to do is $100 billion. So it's a significant hurdle there. As you see, no proposed solution for the Highway Trust Fund shortfall, so if anyone's got a good idea, call your representative, call your senator. And on the environmental side, there's a lot of things that we as a country have done on the environmental side to make highway projects as environmentally friendly as possible. So there's current practices. There's been proposals like the Green New Deal have been presented out there that have some different aspects. And then there's people in the House that are going to push those aspects. And so on the environmental side, there's probably going to be some conflict as well. There's going to be some different points of view and having to come together and meet in the middle to agree upon what the environmental side of this bill is going to look like. The resiliency is kind of new. Actually, I don't know if the last one had anything in it about resiliency, but I think it's getting more attention now. So it's new, it just has that much further to go to get agreed upon, depending upon how much they want to address in here. So those are things that have to get worked out in this. When we talk about the hurdles that are out there and what has to get done, and we have a year to do it, here's what we're talking about. The gasoline tax, 18.4 cents, been there since 1993. The purchasing power of every penny collected is only 60% of what it was in 1993, and that's the problem. If it just would have been indexed towards inflation, we'd be having a much different conversation right now. I'm sure there would still be funding issues to address, but it wouldn't be $100 billion. That's the gap. That's what has to be overcome. And just to give you an idea of what this means to the public, so here in Illinois, the cost to the residents to everybody. And this is not your taxes paid, this is what you're paying out of pocket or it's costing you one way or another. $18.3 billion a year is what it costs the residents of Illinois to put up with bad surface transportation. There's about just over 12.5 million people here, I believe, so that's $1,500 a person. I mean, that's $1,500 for every driving adult and then $1,500 for every grade school and high school kid and so on. So it is significant. There's real consequences to the driving public. This audience knows that as well as anybody. So that's what we're talking about. That's the cost of inaction. For the highway reauthorization, it's going to expire in 2020. I'm sure a lot of people in this room remember years past when the highway bill expired and they didn't get a new one put in place, and so there was continuing resolutions, and it went on for months or maybe a year or two, I forget. Again, this group understands if you don't know where the funding's coming from, throws all your plans into disarray. I don't know that the general public understands that as well as this group does. The cost is real, the effects are real. We just really need Congress to get to work on this. We do expect Congress to work on this diligently. We expect, there's already been work, and so that's a good sign. As we're having conversations with members of Congress, we're getting that indication. So there's good signs, but there's just some big hurdles. And you can see that last bullet point, there's just a group in Washington that says it's not going to be an increase in the gas tax, period. And when they take that point of view, then your options become rather limited. So it's going to be interesting. It's going to be a lot of work to get it done. FP Squared is having those conversations with our legislators and passing along to them what we're hearing from the industry, but also a big part of what we're telling them is, look, preservation is incredibly important to the highway reauthorization bill, because preservation properly done and preservation done to all the candidate roads could really save some money in this whole scenario. Make sure that preservation as part of this bill is adequately addressed so that we're making those dollars go, every dollar that they're struggling to figure out how to raise gets maximized when it gets put into play. So that's part of our message to Congress. We expect the Congress to work on highway reauthorization. It's really up to the Trump administration to decide what they want to do on a large infrastructure package. We'll just wait and see on that one. There's plenty of stuff going on in the administration. So we'll have to see. But I think you can count on a lot of work on the surface transportation side. Another thing I want to mention to everybody is I've been going to Capitol Hill now for about 8 years. TRB in January every year. Started taking a day out of that trip and scheduling time to go visit our legislators in Washington. And so sometimes we'd get an audience with the legislator themselves. Sometimes it's their staff. I'll never forget the first time I went to Washington and sat down with a local legislator. It was when early in the Obama administration and the stimulus package was being debated. We scheduled an appointment. They scheduled the appointment, come in, sit down with our representative, and they said, all right, what brings you to Washington? What would you like to talk about today? And we was like, we want to talk about roads and highways. Really? Yeah, we'd love to talk to you about roads and highways. Nobody comes to talk to us about roads and highways. We figured you were here to say, looking for a handout on this stimulus package. And we'd love for you to spend money on roads, but it's not about the stimulus package. So it was quite the eye-opener that, as something as critically as important, this group, I love, being in this group, people that love roads, that understand how important they are to the public. When you go to the legislature, nobody comes to talk about it. So my point is, they need some education. They need some information on what's happening in the world, and what they can do about it. So the other thing I expected, I was told, okay, in this office, you're going to visit with our transportation specialist. Well, the transportation specialist had been out of college for about 2 years and certainly didn't have a civil engineering degree. So it's just the intern that happens to have infrastructure, but they might also have healthcare and something else. They're not industry experts that are on Capitol Hill. So they really do need some input from us. They need to hear our point of view. I would encourage you to visit with legislators, local, Washington, all of the above, write letters, visit when you can. They all have local offices, and then when they're on recess, they're at home. So it really does make a difference when you go talk to the legislators about here's what's happening in your district and here's why it matters, and they really will listen. So now those of you that are agency employees, you cannot do that as a professional. You can't say on behalf of this DOT, I'm writing you this letter and requesting that you do this, but you can certainly do it as a private citizen. You can, from home, write a letter that says, this is what I'd like to see, or this is what I encourage you to do when it comes to infrastructure. For private industry, I go with my business card and my taxpayer hat at the same time. So it's work, it's effort, but it does make a difference. Due to continued repeated visits on behalf of FP squared, we do get some calls of, this is Senate Roberts' office, and we've got a question about preservation and wanted to talk to you about it before we start working on this reauthorization bill. That's fantastic when they're calling us and saying, I need some help on this. It does make a difference. It does matter. With that, I appreciate your time. I will take any questions, but that's what's happening on the legislative side right now.
Lobbying for pavement preservation is probably FP squared's #1 priority or mission. Are you confident that preservation will be funded in the next surface transportation bill or even increased?
I am confident that preservation will be treated positively. There's no talk of saying this many dollars is going to go to preservation. There's just no talk of that. So it'll be funded in the way that everything else is funded through the programs, the different programs that are in place. But we're highly confident that preservation will be treated fairly, treated as another tool in the toolbox when it comes to the entire surface transportation network. That's been pretty well established, and like I say, when we have senators calling us, senator's office calling up saying, I need to talk to you about preservation, I think that's a pretty good sign that's the case.
Using the philosophy of if you're in a hole, the first thing you do is stop digging. I understand that a gas tax is a really hard thing to discuss, but if there's a gas tax in place already, was there any even discussion of at least starting to index it now? Now I realize that's not very much money, but if we wait a few more years before we do it, it gets worse. Is gas tax such a difficult issue that even at this point that we can't increase it, but we'd say, well, we'll at least index it so it keeps up with inflation? Has that even been discussed at all?
I've not myself been in any conversations about just start indexing it right now. I understand the point, and I think it's a great point. I just think what I understand is there's just some in the legislature that's saying, I'm not going to do anything that looks like raising taxes. So it'd be a conflict. How's that?
It seems the political reality is the Republicans can't raise taxes because they'll get slayed by their own voters, and the Democrats aren't going to do it because they'll get slayed by Republicans in come elections. So, it's most likely not going to happen. Everybody in this room probably realizes it. Have you guys looked at trying to do something through the state level? Like Texas recently passed a constitutional amendment that took almost 3/4 of their oil and gas revenue, supported by the voters of the state by like 80%, to take half of that 3/4 of their oil and gas revenue and put it into their state highway fund, which has pumped, I think, something around like $8 billion into the state highway fund over the last few years. Have you had any kind of success like that on a state level, more so than trying at the federal level where we just seem to be spinning our wheels?
FP squared simply doesn't have the resources to work at the state level. Simply too many people to try and contact, and too many voices or too many people to get that message across to. So we've focused strictly on the federal side, simply because we're not that big of an organization. Very encouraged by what the states are doing, including Illinois. That's fantastic. But I think there's not a movement saying, we've not observed a movement in Washington saying, states are taking care of it, we don't have to worry about it anymore. Washington's still looking at it like we need to do our part. Thank you very much. Appreciate your time.
The preceding was produced by the National Center for Pavement Preservation. More information can be found on the web at pavementpreservation.org. Additional support provided by Michigan State University.